Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar on navigating the new cybersecurity disclosure rules. Now, we all know cybersecurity is big on the agenda, and there's a lot of pressure from a regulatory perspective on lots of different organizations and different verticals, and I would say none more so than the public companies. Now, the SEC's rules became effective in December 23, and they're putting significant pressure on public companies on how they disclose their cybersecurity posture and incidents which they can potentially fall victim to. And this obviously creates a lot of problems because there's timelines associated with this. And you could argue, what are you going to know about a cybersecurity incident within a very short period of time when you haven't conducted your forensics, when you're not sure what actually has happened, and there's a degree of ambiguity around it? And in most cases, when being a public company, there's a big concern around data. You know, if we had an exfiltration, what data was taken? Was it taken from a database? Was it taken from our SaaS collaboration tools? Was it taken from endpoints? And what type of risk does that propose? So we're going to look at I'm going to have our panelists share their perspectives on the future of cybersecurity, data security posture management, aligning interests, and the timelines associated with that. And to introduce my panelists, first and foremost, we've got Raluca Sachanu, who is a world-class expert, not only in cybersecurity, but also in governance and in policies, everything from FedRAMP to ISO, simply the best of the best, but also as a chief executive of a publicly listed cybersecurity company. She not only falls under this scrutiny herself, but also for her customers. Then we've Brian Johnson, again, an amazing cybersecurity professional. And while not in a publicly listed company, he is at the front lines with Liberty University from a cyber perspective, from a data perspective, and definitely one of the very best in North America when it comes to anything to do with cyber or data. Then we've James McCarthy, and I will say, I've heard James speak many times about data security, and without any shadow of a doubt, one of the single best subject matter experts out there. And right now in leadership with ForcePoint, who are quickly becoming the go-to global provider from a data security everywhere perspective. So really interested in James's perspectives on how organizations can implement a strategy to deal with these rules. And then finally, but not least, we have Mark Brosnan, the chief executive of Get Visibility, which is an AI-powered data security company, helping some of the world's largest organizations to get their head around the complex challenges of data and using AI to deal with that problem at scale. I'm going to start off, Raluca, with you. And when we talk about the future of cybersecurity governance, and we talk about the board composition, as the CEO of a publicly traded company, can you share your perspectives on this SEC ruling from a board composition perspective? And do you believe that current boards will require an adjustment so that they can effectively deal with the new complexity that the ruling is bringing?
Sure. Thank you for that lovely introduction, and it's lovely to see you all today. From an SEC ruling perspective, we've got a little bit more of an oversight from a board perspective, but the other roles are quite important as well, and I'll touch on the board in a second. Well, when you're looking at the kind of close coordination that is needed when it comes to ensuring readiness, you've got the CIO and the CISO who are overseeing the information security strategy, and they need to regularly provide evidence that their program is effective. So from a disclosure perspective, they need to make sure that their program has enough details and the right details to provide the right information to stakeholders. And one of the pieces of information that is crucial for the board to understand as well is how material the incident is. So that's the first determination, and that's the first role that is really important. Then secondly, you've got the role of the general counsel. So that comes in when they need to determine whether the incident is material, but also to make sure that disclosure is drafted so that it doesn't give away confidential information. Then the role of the CEO and the board comes in, and they need to make sure that they really understand cyber risk. They need to provide evidence that they're taking the right steps to mitigate the risks. And they need to ensure that they are happy enough with what the CISO is providing them, and that they have enough knowledge to oversee the area. So in relation to your specific question around restructuring and what's the major change, the first major change is that there is a need for robust board oversight. So companies it's not just a disclosure that's new, but it's also the fact that you need to provide an annual report of your process for identifying and assessing and managing material risk. And this is where the role of the board is really important, because ultimately it falls on them that they communicate that they've taken enough steps to identify, respond to an incident, and ensure that they prevent an incident, of course. So the boards, they need to be really well informed. They need to understand their organization's risk posture. They need to get really good dashboards and risk metrics in place, and they need to make sure that this information is digestible and provided to investors and other stakeholders.
Wow, you've really thought through that in depth. Given the really detailed answer you've given us here, Mark, I have a question for you. And I've gone to a lot of I go to a lot of Gartner events and Forrester events, and one of the overriding themes at those events is that organizations are overstretched, under-resourced, they're under a lot of pressure. And now when we look at the oversight and the non-disclosure aspects of this ruling, what are the challenges in your mind that boards are going to face in addressing the data security trade-off and the efficiency of actually being able to report when they need to report effectively?
Yeah, I suppose there's a lot of layers to that question. First and foremost, it makes perfect sense as to why you need to make a disclosure around the data being leaked. You've obviously got compliance and privacy concerns when you're handling very sensitive data. But more so now, organizations are also recognizing that the value of their organization and the value to shareholders is intrinsically linked in a lot of cases to the data that they hold, whether that be trade secrets or intellectual property. And that data being in the hands of somebody else or a competitor or publicly available has a significant impact on the value of a business, right? It makes a lot of sense why there is no mandated reporting around that. That's a difficult problem to solve, though, because that data can be in a lot of different places and can come under a lot of different definitions. And with the advent of remote work and applications and lots of productivity and lots of mergers and acquisitions and remote working, that data is being used more and more, but it's starting to sprawl and end up in multiple different locations, some of it under control, some of it out of control. And trying to get your head around that controls in the first place can be very difficult. And then when you're doing that against the clock after a breach and you haven't been proactive around understanding your data, putting those data controls in place, it becomes immeasurably more difficult. The solution, and Gartner speaking around this, and there's a big groundswell across all practitioners now to data security posture management, is actually getting to that source of truth, getting to that ground zero around what data is in the organization, how it's changing, how it's defined, contextualizing it. And from that point, then engaging in a mature conversation around, okay, what's our risk profile here? How much of this data do we need completely locked down, and how much needs to help manage the business? And one of the key outputs of doing that means very good oversight and understanding of your data. So when you do get to a disclosure, it's not a crisis of just trying to build that from scratch, right? So
yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So if James, if I could jump to you for a minute, right? I've heard you speak very eloquently about the data problem, the data challenge, and you guys in ForcePoint, you've an amazing stack of different capability from a cyber perspective, but you're moving in a big way into the data realm, right? And from a vendor reliance perspective, and with the pressure that's on the board, which Luke and Mark have spoken about, how can companies leverage cybersecurity vendors to ensure that they're implementing this strategy correctly, given the layers of complexity that Mark just spoke about?
Yeah, so thank you for that question, Ronan. Also, thanks for putting me third after Luca and Mark, because now I can just say what they said and sound incredibly sophisticated. So let's talk about two things very quickly. First, the most intriguing bit about this SEC rule is that it removes the veil of mysticality from cybersecurity and puts the board and the board members directly engaged and responsible for the business outcomes of their cybersecurity program. We haven't seen anything like this before. So Mark used the word intrinsically linked, and I think that's exactly true. There's as a security vendor over the course of my 25 years doing this, oftentimes security is seen as the magical bit that kind of lives in the corner, and we don't have to talk about it that much because it's so interesting and intriguing. Now we have to talk about everything. So that's the first thing. What does the vendor community need to do today? We have to get much more effective at translating the technology into the business outcome. And as it relates to data, when I think about data, we talk about this all the time, Ronan. Imagine and being able to embrace this audit. Imagine arming your entire board and everyone inside the organization to lean into these questions. What is the data that you deem important to the organization? Where does it live? Who has access to it? Why do they have access to that data? And most importantly, what are they doing with that data? The SEC is asking us to even disclose, do we have third parties interacting with this data? And so you have to be able to answer those questions. And as a vendor, I need to get out of the world of mysticality, of the bits and the bytes, and I have to arm my customers with our data security solutions to be able to have these types of conversations. So it's beholden on the vendor community to understand how linked now the board is to the actual things that they're deploying out in the field to mitigate risk, what the implications of those technologies are, and most importantly, how they can have a lean into the audit conversation. So that's on us.
That's a brilliant answer. Brian, I want to jump to you, right? You're a guy at the front lines. You're responsible for, protecting a very large university, and obviously in the academic sector, you've got a lot of complexity with data. You guys have a massive repository of data. You've, thousands of students and alumni, and I guess my question for you is that, although you're not a publicly regulated entity, you see the academic sector globally get targeted quite aggressively from various threat actors, and you're starting to see regulation like GDPR or CCPA or different regulations coming in. So for a guy like you at the front lines protecting the university, how much of an overhead is regulation in your world?
Well, thanks, Ronan. I want to echo everyone's comments and just say, glad to be here with this very talented group of people. And I'll dig in with my response, and some of it will piggyback off of what everyone else has said. But regulation impacts my day-to-day in various ways, and really the first one is ensuring that my organization's information security program meets and exceeds requirements that are established in various federal and state laws that are governing cybersecurity, as well as standards involving payment cards, and they all have a significant impact on the resources required to meet regulation requirements. But what does that specifically involve? And it starts with incident response plans and making sure we have those tested annually. Then we make sure we're doing IT risk assessments with a focus on sensitive data, sensitive systems, and that we have the controls in place. Mark mentioned controls in place to protect them and to respond to incidents concerning them. And then, conducting frequent gap analysis to make sure we, cover the areas where we fall short. And then, validating our mitigation strategies and through recurring penetration testing, weekly and monthly recurring vulnerability scanning and assessments. But then really it comes down to knowing where our sensitive data is. And James hit some of this, but who are the data owners? Who are the data custodians and the system owners? And then ensuring that they, know how their data is being stored. Sometimes they don't, and how it's being shared and how it's being protected. And then partnering with those data owners and custodians to implement a sound data protection strategy. And then second, getting to sort of the reporting and the disclosure requirement. This will hit home with that. Ensuring our organization meets reporting requirements in a timely manner. In the education field, that can be as quick as 24 hours to get the initial report out. Yeah, and so if the organization doesn't have that information security program that explains, how the organization does the things that I just mentioned, then knowing the details on what are required to report can be very challenging. So, on top of everything that a security team is already doing, which usually is a pretty busy endeavor in itself, security operations, vendor risk management, security awareness and anti-phishing efforts, ensuring the organization is compliant with those regulations can be a significant drain. But bottom line, if the foundations are in place before the auditors come knocking on your door, you're going to be in a better place.
You really got to the crux of the problem there, I believe, and you've done it very eloquently. And Raluca, this leads me into a question for you, right? But before I get to the question, let me set the scene. I believe, as a guy who's been in the trenches in cyber for the last 25 years at this stage, I'm giving away my age, that we're moving very much from a cyber dazzle perspective where people are selling point solutions to an area or an arena where people are looking for posture management. So what does the posture of our cloud look like? What does the posture of our SaaS applications look like? What does our data posture look like? And I think that's super important because that holistic view allows, and to all of your points that you've already spoken about, allows organizations and leadership teams to make decisions based on the posture, and maybe the posture on specific areas needs to be better than the posture in other areas, because we know that there's no silver bullet for this problem. So when we talk specifically about data security posture management, Raluca, you're responsible for protecting some of the largest companies in North America, where you would have typically delivered the security operations center capability, correlating all of the events across their EDR, their XDR, their firewalls, their SIM, and all of that good stuff with a high degree of orchestration and automation. But you're now, I guess, starting to see how public companies are looking to take the compliance aspect of the challenge and combine that, as Brian just hit the nail on the head, and put that onto the cyber operations as well. Because I've never seen a guy like Brian who's not overstretched, under-resourced, even though he's got broad shoulders, continually under pressure to deliver. So from your perspective, how is the security operations world embracing this new technology, posture management, data security posture management, and how are you guys dealing with that?
That statement is absolutely right. And there's two main reasons for that, that we're seeing. Number one, a lot of security leaders are getting pressure from their boards that they, give the right kind of details and the right figures and the right explanation in relation to their security program. And secondly, there's a lot of complexity around data security and cybersecurity right now. There are a lot of tools out there. There's a bit of a lack of control. And what happens when there's a lack of control, you need to put a number on it and you need to show, okay, what is actually our maturity posture right now? So we're certainly seeing a lot of our clients now removing the data security aspect from their governance team and bringing it back to security, because it is becoming a lot more complex. So, and one of the most common effects of a cyber incident, and I would say the motivation of cyber criminals being centered around it, is of course data breaches. So the data element. Yeah. So we're seeing a lot of organizations implementing stricter data controls into their entire MDR operations. They want to consolidate. They want to have one vendor or one partner for multiple things rather than going to 5 different partners, which only increases the complexity of operations. So we're seeing a lot of renewed focus on DLP, for example, which then inherently brings a focus on data security, data discovery, data classification, but also what you mentioned as well, another element that is getting a lot more attention from CISOs is the data security posture management. So we're seeing a bridging of all these elements into one, and mainly because of the complexity around it, but also in order to remove that complexity, they want to bring it under one umbrella.
Great answer. James, let me jump to you for a moment, right? Let's assume for a moment I'm a legacy vendor and I'm delivering, you know, what I would term to be reactive solutions, such as let's say some old school, maybe SWIGs or CASB or SASE type technologies, right? Which are reactive technologies to a degree. I mean, you guys in ForcePoint are moving to being very much a proactive organization. So, you know, using technology to go in and help companies to build a really robust foundation. And then when you've built the foundation layer, you move up into the reactive layer. So can you talk a little bit about how data security posture management is helping companies to shift from being reactive to being a more proactive in their posture, and what does that look like?
Yeah, I absolutely can. As you know, this is a passion of mine. So I honestly feel some level of guilt having been in this industry for so long, because we've built reactive technologies. And so therefore we are constantly behind, right? The threat actors are obviously phenomenal. They're using AI probably better than we are today. And as vendors, we need to understand how to be more proactive with our tooling. But imagine a world, Ronan, where we weren't reactive, where we literally had a map of our risk. And the word posture is so important in this conversation. I'm thinking about my posture now, and I'm, you know, improving it as I go through this call, because the posture needs to improve for our organizations that we protect. And how do you improve the posture? You show the risk. So rather than being reactive, let's have an overarching view. Let's understand all of the data that lives in our systems that are land-based, our EC2, our RDS, our GCP instances are. Let's understand where everything is. And then let's go back to the point of risk and stop that data from flowing into places that we don't want it to go, right? So this is then an improving posture. It's a forward-leaning, preventative type of approach versus just reacting to the fact that, holy cow, I now have 400,000 credit cards in an S3 bucket that's publicly exposed. Shoot, we should not have done that. Okay, let's not do that again. Ronan, the only way to answer that question is by understanding where all of your data is. And that is really the promise of the DSPM landscape. So data security posture management is this notion of understanding your current risk profile and then going right back to the source and being able to prevent those sorts of risks from continuing to blossom. And it really makes me proud that we're in this space, because it's not a reactive technology, it's a proactive technology.
Absolutely. Mark, can I ask you to, I want to paint 2 scenarios for you, Mark, and if you could maybe shed some light on what the difference looks like in both scenarios. I am a large hospital. One of my users has had their credentials harvested. The threat actors have escalated privileges. They've got access to the soft underbelly of the network, and they've had a period of time in there looking around and potentially exfiltrating data. And we're now in a position, or let's not say a hospital, let's say a publicly listed company. We're now in a position where we've just found out, and we need to go and conduct forensics, but we know the clock is ticking, right? And we're going to have to report. And I want you to maybe compare that to another scenario where a company have implemented effective data security posture management, who have categorized, have built a strategy, have built a roadmap, have identified their data assets. And what does the difference in the reporting look like that in both scenarios, the speed of that reporting and the comfort level that the board get to by having posture management dealt with effectively. Mark, you're on mute, I think.
So first off, I would argue that the company who has been proactive has locked down that data and is far less likely to be in that really uncomfortable position to start with. I'm a big fan of the Peter Drucker, the famous consultant, saying of what gets measured gets managed. And that's very, very true from a data and a data security perspective. So if you're measuring it and monitoring it and you're knowing what's there, it gets managed. You get that proactive solution. Quite frequently, we get pulled into scenarios where customers or potential customers or clients have the issues around, look, we've had a breach. We don't know what's been taken. We've got the reporting coming up. We're under massive fallout. We're engaging with our PR team, but we don't know what to tell them. And it turns into an all-consuming scenario for that organization, and they start to lose trust and they start to lose share price, and it turns into a very damaging situation because ultimately they have to go away, find all of the data, come to an agreement on what the definition and meaning of that data is, come to a definition or come to an understanding of, well, what compliance breach is there, what business damage is there, and that turns into technically a very difficult situation. It turns into a scenario where you're trying to pull together business compliance and security all at the same time. And it's a very unpleasant scenario that has a very long tail in terms of impact to the organization trying to fix that and clean it up. Organizations who do that through the course of proactive management in terms of understanding their risk bit by bit and putting controls and measurements and gap analysis, like Brian said, around that, have a very good idea of what was breached and what was taken, and in all likelihood have already identified their really high risk, high impact information, have it well protected, either encrypted or locked down, and are not in that scenario. So there's a very difference, not only in terms of the outcome, but the probability of the outcome as well between those two different scenarios.
Yeah, really, really well answered. Brian, you're getting the thin end of the wedge here, right? Because I think the guys have done a really good job in answering that. But I guess my question for you is, are you in agreement with what the guys have spoken about? And, you know, it's you having to deal with some of the compliance scenarios that you outlined earlier, already being under the level of stress that you're under because you guys are a huge university. So does having DSPM implemented, in your view, drive compliance efficiency? Does it help you keep the GRC folks at bay or the auditors at bay? And how in your mind, how does it make your life easier?
So it does. And you know, both James and Mark were you know, really hitting on some of the points I'm gonna mention. So I will be just reinforcing it. But yeah, bottom line, it does line up exactly with what they're saying. And you know, for us, you know, when an incident or a potential incident gets brought to the security team or the CISO's attention, you know, that incident response and reporting clock starts at that point. You know, in the first phase of the computer security incident response team's, you know, plan is identification. And once that triage team confirms or identifies the event as a data loss event, then we move into management. And it's in that phase where you're asking, the CSIRT team is asking questions of, you know, what servers and storage were affected, what data was leaked, and what is the extent of the customer base affected. And then, you know, since a lot of the new rules talk about materiality, you know, of an incident, organizations have to answer that quickly, and you don't have a lot of time. So you know, Mark was hitting it right on target.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I mean, if you find yourself in a position where you cannot articulate what the contents of that box was, that's you know, to the layman, they're like, why can't you tell us? But we all know that, you know, actually giving granular visibility of that is a complex challenge.
It is, and you know, so DSPM specifically, that's how a security team partners with the customers throughout the organization, and it makes that scoping process, that, you know, quantification and qualification analysis, much more streamlined process. And implementing, like Raluca mentioned earlier, data discovery, data classification solutions, they're key to knowing where your sensitive data resides, who owns it, and then like has been repeated many times, what controls do you have in place around it? And one of the things that I'm really excited about in a DSPM solution is data inventory. And that seems pretty straightforward, but it's hard to do, and it's often not done until after the fact. But knowing quickly where a listing of the organization's critical data, where it resides, whether it's in specific drives, if it's on-prem, is it in the cloud, is it in OneDrive, Google Drive, or perhaps it's on an email server, or even an endpoint's local drive. DSPM, that's how an organization can map that data to specific users, and that's key. In some form of role-based access control format, and really the big takeaway is the criticality that you can determine with an inventory. So if you have that DSPM, you can, hopefully you can tag those critical data, either shares, owners, or actual, locations and files, and that impact analysis becomes a much more straightforward process. And when you do have that unfortunate data loss event, it's going to significantly impact your ability to more quickly report to SEC. And then, I do say partner, I use that term, and that's really what it is, because if your security team is the one that's driving DSPM and you're doing DSPM for the security team, you're probably doing it wrong. It really should be those data owners and the stakeholders that are benefiting from the DSPM.
Brilliant, brilliant. Okay, I want to change gears. I want to go into aligning interests, and nobody better to comment on this opening part than you, Raluca. Not only are you a chief executive, but you're also a former auditor yourself, so you understand FedRAMP, you understand ISO, you understand them all. So you understand the art of diplomacy in dealing with auditors and compliance people. So when you're communicating and collaborating between boards and the SEC, how do you communicate or foster a relationship to ensure that you can demonstrate that you're implementing these new regulations? Because we know this is not there's no silver bullet to fix this. But what's your advice in terms of framing the narrative to show that you're on a journey to improve this, and aligning that the board and the SEC are in the same place?
Well, the worst thing that you can do is hide details and hide information, or even worse, when the hackers communicated on your behalf, which we have seen. We've seen instances where the hackers have got in and then they communicated to the SEC that the particular victim hasn't disclosed it. So it's really important to maintain an open and honest line of communication, and while understanding, of course, that you can't reveal very sensitive information. But for that to happen, boards really need to understand the ins and outs of their organization, the program, the cyber program, because they will be the ones responsible for communicating it. And they have to communicate it to investors, and they have to communicate it to the SEC when an incident happens. So it has to be done in a way that is digestible, as I mentioned earlier. And it's not just the board, it's the CISO and the general counsel teams. They'll need to make sure that their files are presented in a way that they give sufficient information without, again, revealing confidential data, which is an art form in itself. But when you're communicating a particular incident, transparency will be key, and it has to be planned in advance. And that's why, like Brian said, a good incident response plan is crucial, because you're preparing for scenarios, you're preparing for what to communicate. You need to test the plan, and when you're testing the plan, don't put it on the security team only. You need to welcome in the board, and you need to bring in general counsel or chief legal officer and your marketing people and your PR people, and you need to train them all. Okay, what are you going to say next? And what are you going to do next? And who are you going to say it to? And that has to be planned in advance based on different scenarios. But the other element that is really important is that when you're disclosing an incident, it's important to consider prior responses, especially if you've had incidents before, and analyze the impact for those incidents. See how they have been resolved, and make sure that you don't have any inconsistencies in answers, because this can lead to a bit of distrust from the SEC and shareholders. And remember that similar to GDPR, if you can prove that you have implemented preventative actions, and if you can prove that you've done the best that you could to implement a solid cyber program, they will take that into consideration when they decide what fine you should get or how that should be communicated to further shareholders.
Brilliant answer. James, I think the year was, let me guess, 2016, the former Uber CISO was convicted by a federal jury for what was, I think, was classed as fraud. And basically it was for not disclosing to regulators that they had suffered some significant compromises of Uber data. And that really drove, it sent a shock through the industry, because CISOs were saying, you know what, there is a culture of trying to, cover up cyber breaches because they have a profound damaging effect on the organization. But I think with this ruling, what we're going to see is we're going to see directors and officers' insurance, and the price of that insurance and the policies are going to be linked to how well they're building their program of works. Now, do you think this will incentivize stronger cybersecurity practices? And is it going to have the kind of same impact that, a CISO getting incarcerated for not disclosing will have? What's your view on that?
Yeah, so I think obviously time will tell, and I think we've seen a few things that have been implemented over the last, say, decade that felt like there might be litigious outcomes in certain regards, and sort of they were more like a mouse than a muddy line. So we don't know yet, but I will say this: Brian talked about this opportunity to have a data inventory. And I think as cybersecurity professionals, one of the kind of throwaway statements that we've come to use is data is new currency, right? Data is truly an asset. Data is an asset. So when you think about linking cyber risk and the insurance of cyber risk, particularly at the officer level, I don't know about the folks on the phone, but I have a pretty good inventory of my 401k plan and my bank statement and what's sitting in my Force Point stock. So I know all that. I know it intimately. But I would say that most organizations don't have that same level of detail for their data. And if you don't, then how can you link that back to the risk that the insurance folks are going to be asking you for, right? So what kind of coverage do you need? What's the asset inventory? And asset inventory, we're talking about data here. So, I don't know what it'll mean, but I know that when the auditors come, or when the cyber insurance folks come knocking, that without that inventory and understanding of what those assets are and their value and their worth, it'll be impossible to place a risk scenario. And so I don't know what the future holds, Ronan, but I'm telling you that there will be this link again to that full data inventory, the value to the organization, and what it means for coverage.
Brilliant. Mark, from a legal disclosure readiness perspective, in your opinion, how should a board be proactive and prepared for a cyber incident? When we consider the old saying in cyber is, it's not a case of if you'll be hacked, it's when. You're on mute, I think.
Comes back to the same thing that James was saying. It's kind of knowing the value of the data and the inventory, knowing what you have first, and knowing that in the context of the different risk and compliances you have. It comes down to then being able to make the right decisions in a pressurized or stressful environment. And as I said earlier, it can be very stressful. And the last thing you want is trying to find out the baseline, which is, well, what is the data and how is it and who's with access to it and how long did we have it? Having all of that information at your fingertips is really, really important. So like any other aspect of being on a board, you need to have the key critical information at your fingertips, whether that be the finances or the sales metrics. Your data and your data inventory needs to be a really important part of that. And then making decisions becomes a lot easier as to what you report and don't report and how you report it. And it's not only the reporting, it's managing of the we're starting to see that cyber incidents have very significant impacts on customer trust. So,
So
how
Mark,
you manage the PR for that as well is very, very much linked.
So Mark, in that regard, right, when we talk about Uber at the start, okay, I think it's important to acknowledge when we talk about data and data assets and data inventory, not all data is created equal, right? And if I'm an Uber type company, my predominant valuable data is B2C information, right? And I'm guessing that, depending on the type of organization you are, you have, your crown jewels. And in the event, I mean, it's not illegal to get breached. It's the case of how well you're prepared after that breach happens, and the steps you've taken for the crown jewels within the soft underbelly of the perimeter, right?
Correct. And look, the definition of the crown jewels can be a bit more complex, because if you're at board level, you'll have a very high level view of what's important, but it's really the practitioners in the business, the people who are in charge of the different departments, know what data they're dealing with, and what their data inventory would look like, and how that data is important to the operations or the competitiveness of that organization. So good DSPM or a good data posture management involves linking the business logic and the business value back up and making it consumable, as Raluca said, to the board. So they have a high level digestible view of the data. They can trust within the process that extracts that from the key stakeholders in the organization.
Okay, thank you. My next point is timelines, and I'm conscious of timelines here. So I'm gonna put this question to all of you, right? And if you could just share your perspectives in as quick a time as possible. But realistically, I mean, to implement the SEC requirements to, let's assume, a 20,000 person company, right? And you guys have all, this is what you do in your day jobs, right? It's your bread and butter. To implement the requirements for a 20,000 person company, and to get a good data security posture so that you can effectively integrate your security controls and your data controls and your GRC controls. I understand and I appreciate that the question is vague, because companies will be at a different point of maturity in their journey. But, typically for a listed vehicle or listed company, they're going to be at a 6 out of 10 in terms of maturity. So starting, I guess, Raluca, with you, then Brian, then Mark, and then James, if you could maybe share your thoughts on how this looks.
Yeah, I can speak from experience. We were dealing with a large pharmaceutical organization, a customer of ours. They're a public organization, and they decided to go with us for their entire security stack. And what I mean by that is MDR, vendor management, data security, absolutely everything. So we were able to measure and quantify the time it took them to go from a basic security program that they had in place. And even though they were a large public organization, they didn't have a large security team. They had some really good tools. So we called it basic security program, to move into a strategic security program, which is what we're talking about here. And it took us 9 months to get to that point together, because we had a really good partnership, and we were able to quantify how long it would have taken if they had done it on their own and from scratch, and it would probably have taken twice the time. So in 9 months, they were able to get to an elevated security posture and to a position where they could satisfy. Now, SEC, these disclosure rules were not the same back then, but if they had been, they would have been in a good position.
Brian?
So I would say it depends, of course. That's not the most popular answer, but I would try to keep my answer pretty short. I think it does go back to what you have in place, and I started with IT. One of the first things I said was IT risk assessments, and those can take, anywhere from like 4 to 6 weeks, depending upon the complexity of the organization. But so if you're already doing those, you've got that, knocked out. And then I would say when you look at governance and oversight, then we're gonna, beat that the data protection again. And if you've got the an information security program that highlights the roles and responsibilities in protecting the organization's systems, networks, users, and data. That will help put the necessary framework in place. But without data governance, specifically like a defined program in place, then you're going to be piecing that together on the fly, and that is going to add significant time to be able to be in a position to report quickly. And then the last thing I'll hit on is, internal controls and policies. And some of the information may be in your information security program, but it might exist outside of that framework in the organization's policy framework. And if those exist, that's great. But if you don't have a policy in place for like data storage, data classification, those are two that jump out. And then the technical controls and the associated procedures that go with them, those are the ones that are going to take the length of time. So in my opinion, it's 3 to 18 months is what you could be looking at, depending upon your level of preparedness.
Mark and James, I want to pivot the question slightly for you guys, right? Because this is important. We've seen, we stand at a pivotal moment in history where artificial intelligence is being used in the data security industry like never before, right? And that solutioning is allowing organizations to significantly accelerate their capabilities around fixing these challenges and being able to demonstrate compliance. So Mark, maybe if you could go first and maybe talk about what you're seeing and why specifically artificial intelligence is allowing organizations to improve that posture from a timeline perspective. And then what does that look like in your mind for, let's say, a 20,000 person company with a relatively good cyber perspective, but like most companies, that soft underbelly of the data is a challenge.
Yeah. So the key to good security posture is having a good idea of where you're going, and having that good idea of where you're going agreed by the key stakeholders in the organization. That's not just the cyber compliance people, it's the business as well. And knowing where you want to go, the next step then is in measuring where you are now and prioritizing or quantifying the size of the gaps between where you need to get to and where you are now. And that's where artificial intelligence is proving very, very powerful. So up until quite recently, finding or understanding the data or being able to measure those gaps became very, very difficult. So you could sit down, you could do tabletop exercises and write loads of policies and get everyone agreeing to the policies. But the practical reality is that, well, these are fine, but how do we understand our data accurately enough or efficiently enough? And how do we do that at scale and at speed to operationalize this? And that's where AI comes in. AI is very, very good at understanding unstructured data and unstructured context and putting meaning to it like a human would. So it's the equivalent of throwing hundreds of thousands of human beings at understanding the documents and sifting through it and doing it very, very quickly. So when you do that and you do it accurately, all of a sudden now you know where you want to get to, you know what data you have, and you can have a meaningful conversation around setting out, well, what happens next? Where do we prioritize? And then you can measure it as you move forward. And that significantly accelerates the time around which this becomes possible from, in my view, 5-6 years down to maybe 3 months to a point where you're starting to become effective around your crown jewels.
And thank you, Mark. And James, from your perspective again, right? First and foremost, you are a data guru, you're the data guy, right? You not only understand the technology because ForcePoint you have a full portfolio of SWIGs and ZTNA and CASB and SASE and so forth, but you're also an AI company. You're now predominantly an AI company and a data company, and you're securing data for some of the largest organizations in North America on the endpoint, on the network, and in the cloud. What's your view of how the technology is accelerating the ability of organizations to harden their posture from a data perspective?
Yeah, so from my point of view, and I know this is maybe a hyperbolic statement, but AI is revolutionizing how we think about solving this problem. And if I can, let me just for a minute I think about this problem from the perspective of Brian or any of the wonderful CISOs that I get to interact with on a daily basis. what's the end of the story? If the end of the story is to be able to effectively understand and respond to these SEC regulations, the end of the story means that I have to be able to answer those 5 questions we talked about, the what, the who, the where, the when, the why. And in order to do those things, I have to sift through and understand vast amounts of data. We just talked about, you mentioned it yourself, Ronan, there are different types of data and they have different values inside the organization. So the thing that felt like boiling the ocean before AI was throwing hundreds of humans into this science project called data classification. Well, do you care? Do you not care? Is it important? Do we use it? Where does it go? And it was absolutely a question that wasn't answered. And so then the vendor community said, you know what, we have the easy button. We'll do these pre-canned rules. And oh, this one's our PCI pack and this one's our HIPAA pack. And all you got to do is push the button and we're going to understand the data. And it, then your technology has a lot of false positives, James. Oh, shoot. Okay, how do we overcome the false positive question? We overcome that question by sifting petabytes of data with AI that can give us a high fidelity return on do we care or do we not? And so if the end of the question is being able to answer these SEC filings, and we want to do it with super high fidelity, then AI is the answer. And I know many of my other vendor colleagues are embracing AI. We here at ForcePoint are really leaning heavily into AI to help us answer that discovery and classification question, which forever has been the long pole in the tent to a really, really effective security posture.
Yeah, really, really well put. And look, I'm conscious that we're out of time, but I think I wanna wrap up by saying, I mean, when you think about the new way of consuming technology, organizations they now outsource responsibility for their software to SaaS vendors. They outsource the responsibility for their platforms to PaaS vendors. They outsource their responsibility for infrastructure to the cloud vendors, Amazon and Google and so forth. But the one thing that they have to maintain responsibility for, irrespective of where it goes, is their data.
Yep.
And that's why I believe that if you ultimately boil this SEC ruling down, it all comes down to, at the end of the day, it's not the problem that whether we had a breach, it's when that breach happened, had we taken the adequate steps to ensure that the crown jewels or the data which we were entrusted with protecting, whether it's in the cloud, on the network, or at the endpoint, that we took the correct steps to harden that data and protect that data in line with best practice. And I think what you're all saying is that that is a journey. That is a journey that is accelerated because of the capability to use AI. I think, Raluca, you very eloquently described how you can now reduce operational overhead by integrating that function into your SOC, where previously your security operation team were just looking at logs coming from your security tooling, but now you're actually you're marrying up the GRC data part of the business and the cybersecurity part of the business, which is ultimately driving a much better overall cybersecurity posture, but also data security posture, and facilitating the ability to respond in an effective way to regulators when or if required. Guys, that was a thoroughly enjoyable session. Thank you all so much for your insights. It was really second to none, and I hope you have a great evening. Thank you so much.